The desert stretched endless and fierce under the burning sun. Waves of heat rolled across the plains, making the horizon shimmer like a mirage, and in that vast emptiness a lone rider appeared, kicking up clouds of dust that clung to every rock and blade of dry grass. Clara Whitmore rode with determination, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble or movement, her hands firm on the reins and her heart steady, though the wind cut across her face with sharp bites of cold and warmth. At the same time, she had learned to read the desert, to hear it, to understand the subtle whispers of the land, and in that silence she felt both freedom and isolation that made every breath precious and every step of her horse deliberate. She had grown up on the edge of Dulcie Creek, a small ranching town where the lines between survival and despair were drawn every morning in sweat and every night in prayers and stories of old men around fire pits who spoke of Apache warriors and of settlers who had carved homes from rock and dust. And she listened as a girl, wondering what it would be like to meet a soul from those stories. And now the moment had arrived, though she did not yet know it, as the storm had broken suddenly in the early hours, turning dry riverbeds into rushing torrents, and she had set out to rescue Amare that had bolted from the corral, and there she found him half submerged in mud and water, a man whose dark hair clung to his forehead, whose eyes flickered with pain and defiance, and whose strength seemed impossible to measure through the weakness of the river's hold. She did not hesitate. She tied the reins of her own horse to a nearby tree and plunged into the water, using all her strength to pull him free against the current. Her muscles screamed, her heart pounded, and yet she did not falter, because in that moment life demanded courage, and she could not stand by as the storm and the land threatened to claim another soul. And when at last she dragged him to solid ground, she knelt beside him, wiping the water from his face and searching for wounds. Her hands steady and unafraid, though the blood was warm and slick, she assessed the twisted leg, the shallow cuts, the bruises beginning to swell, and she knew she had little time to act before the fever and the cold set in. And as she worked, he opened his eyes, confusion and anger flashing in them, and he struggled to push her away. But she held firm because she understood his pride, even as she disregarded it, and she spoke softly, steadying him with words that were both command and comfort. "You will live because I will not leave you. You will breathe because I will not let the desert take you." And he stared at her as if trying to memorize the lines of her face, the fire in her eyes, the firmness in her hands. And there was something about her that was not fragile or fleeting, something that anchored him to the world even as his body ached and the storm raged around them. And in those hours of rain and cold, she built a shelter from branches and hides. She kindled a fire that smelled of smoke and hope, and she tended his wounds, every movement deliberate, every gesture patient and precise. And through the night she kept vigil, listening to the wind, the distant cries of coyotes, the crack of lightning on the rocks, and every time he stirred, she was there, calming, murmuring, adjusting blankets, making sure he breathed. And slowly, as dawn approached, his breathing steadied, and his eyes met hers with something that was no longer pure anger, but something softer, a flicker of trust, perhaps, or gratitude. He spoke in a voice low and rough, as though the words themselves hurt. "I should have died there. Why do you help me?" And she looked at him, her blue eyes steady, her hand still on his arm, because she did not yet fear him or the world around them. Maybe because fear is only a story told too many times, and maybe because you are not just a man, you are storm and a mountain and a wound in the desert that I cannot ignore. And he studied her a long time, darkness and pain mingling with curiosity. And then he whispered, "Have you done this before?" And she shook her head and met his gaze. "No, but perhaps this is the first time we meet in the storm." And the world paused for a breath. In that instant, the heat of the sun and the cold of the water, the endless desert and the lonely mountains, all seemed to bend toward them, as if acknowledging that too souls had crossed paths in a way that mattered beyond fear and duty. And for the first time in a long time, Dakota, the Apache king, felt vulnerability, not as weakness, but as a bridge to something unknown, something alive, something worth holding on to. And Clara felt it too, the power of the land beneath her feet, the wind that spoke through the canyons and the quiet strength of a man who had been forged in battle. Yet humbled by care, and as the dawn broke over the desert, she held his hand. And the firelight reflected in his eyes, and the horizon seemed to open a path neither had anticipated, a path of courage, of choice of hearts, finding each other amidst the unforgiving desert, and so began the crossing of two worlds, the meeting of two souls shaped by fire, wind, and earth, destined to face storms both outside and within, yet united by a moment that would never be forgotten. And as the sun climbed higher, she helped him sit up and guided him to the horse, and together they began a slow trek back to Dulcie Creek, a journey marked by pain and perseverance and the silent acknowledgement that neither world would ever be the same again after this night in the desert, where two hearts met without hesitation, without fear, and with a courage that neither had known they carried, yet both would never forget. The journey across the desert was long and grueling, the sun beating down on Clara and Dakota as they moved slowly over rocks and through dry riverbeds, each step of the horse sending jolts through his injured leg, but neither complained nor wavered, because both understood that survival demanded endurance and determination, and every mile they traveled brought them closer together in ways that went beyond words, and each glance, each subtle movement spoke volumes about trust and respect, and something deeper that neither wanted to name yet could not ignore. Dakota had been raised to distrust outsiders, to see them as threats, and yet here was a woman risking her life to help him, showing courage and compassion in equal measure. And Clara had grown up listening to stories of Apache warriors, strong, fast, and unyielding, and yet nothing had prepared her for the living presence of one standing beside her whose eyes carried storms and quiet wisdom all at once, and the desert seemed to recognize the tension between them, the wind moving softly through sagebrush and mesquite, whispering secrets to anyone who would listen, and birds circling high above as if to bear witness to a meeting of hearts shaped by fire and earth and history. And danger. When they reached the ranch, Clara led Dakota to the bunkhouse, a small structure made of weathered wood and stone, and she helped him inside, settling him on the cot she had prepared. With blankets and fresh water and bandages she moved, with practiced skill, tending his wounds, cleaning cuts, wrapping legs, adjusting pillows so that he would be comfortable as possible given the circumstances, and he watched her with quiet fascination, every movement confident, precise, and caring, and slowly a bond began to form, one built on necessity and mutual respect. And when night fell and the wind howled outside, they sat together, the fire crackling between them, shadows dancing across walls, and Dakota spoke softly as if the words might vanish if said too loudly. "You risk much for me." She shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "You risk nothing. You save life and care for a man who cannot repay you." And he studied her as if trying to memorize every line of her face, every flicker of expression, every quiet strength that radiated from her. "You are not like others," he murmured, and Clara smiled faintly and leaned back against the wall. "I am not like others." He looked at her, the weight of his people and his world pressing on him, and yet he felt something he had never expected, a warmth, a connection, a desire to protect and to be protected in return. And she asked quietly, "Will you live?" And he nodded slowly, the firelight reflecting in his eyes a mixture of pride and vulnerability. "Well, because you choose it." She shook her head again and whispered, "No, because you deserve it." And as the night deepened, they spoke of their lives in fragments, Clara telling him of Dulcie Creek, of horses and cattle, of work from dawn to dusk, of dreams she barely dared to speak aloud, and Dakota telling her of mountains and valleys, of his people, of lessons from elders, of battles fought and lost, of honor carried like a weight on his shoulders. And in that exchange the barriers between them began to crumble, the desert outside holding its breath as if acknowledging that two hearts were learning to speak the same language, even if the words themselves were different. And over the following days Dakota regained strength, his leg healing slowly under her care, and with each step he took he felt the courage to trust a woman who had no reason to risk herself for him. And Clara felt her heart tightening in ways she could not ignore as she watched him rise stronger each day, his presence a constant reminder that life could be both fragile and fierce. And one evening, as the sun bled red into the sky, they stood on the porch of the bunkhouse watching the mountains in the distance. Dakota looked at her and asked quietly, "Have you done this before, helping a man who could be your enemy?" And she met his gaze steadily. "No," he said softly. "Then let me show you what I know." And in that instant the wind seemed to pause, the birds circled lower, the fireflies rose from the sage, and the desert became witness to a bond neither could yet name, but both understood. And the days continued to pass with labor and care and quiet conversations, and every shared task, every glance, every touch became a thread weaving them closer together. And when a threat from outsiders came near Dulcie Creek, Clara felt no fear, because she knew that together they could face whatever storms approached. And Dakota felt no hesitation, because for the first time he realized that honor was not only in battle, but also in choosing to protect someone he cared for. And their connection grew not from passion alone, but from the steadfast courage to face danger, to heal, to trust, and to stand together. And when night fell again, they would sit beside the fire, her hand brushing his as if by accident, his eyes finding hers with unspoken acknowledgement that the desert and the storm and the trials of two worlds had brought them together for something neither had expected, something rare and precious, something that would grow stronger with every challenge and every sunrise. And so the crossing of two worlds continued each day, a testament to bravery, to trust, to the beginnings of love forged in the fires of hardship and the quiet moments of care. And neither knew yet how far this path would take them, but both understood that from this night onward their lives were entwined as tightly as the roots of the mesquite trees that clung stubbornly to the desert floor. And the wind carried their silent vows across the canyon, whispers of courage, whispers of hearts meeting under the indifferent sky of the west. And each step they took together became a promise that neither storms nor enemies nor time itself could erase. And so the story of the Apache king and the brave rancher woman grew quietly in the desert each day, a layer of trust, a bond of loyalty, and the spark of something that could become a fire capable of lighting even the darkest nights. Clara had watched Dakota regain his strength day by day, and with every sunrise she felt a pull in her chest, a tightening she could not name, but that left her restless when he was not near. And Dakota felt it too, a stirring in his heart, a warmth that was new and unsettling, yet exhilarating, because it belonged to no battlefield and demanded no strategy. It was simply there, a presence that he could not ignore. And as the desert stretched endless around them, the two of them began to move closer, not just in distance, but in spirit, understanding each other in glances and gestures in the quiet way. The wind seemed to carry messages only they could hear, and it was in the small moments that the bond deepened. When Clara handed him water, and he accepted it with a nod; when he offered guidance about the land, and she listened without hesitation; when they shared a fire at night, speaking softly of dreams, fears, and memories, both old and recent. And though the world outside their little sanctuary was harsh and unforgiving, the desert and mountains holding secrets of danger and death, they found moments of peace, moments where hearts spoke louder than words. And it was during one of these moments, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, that Dakota turned to Clara, his eyes dark and searching. "Have you done it before, risking yourself for someone you barely know?" he asked, and Clara looked at him steadily, her hands brushing the coarse fabric of her skirt, and her voice quiet but firm. "No, but perhaps this is the first time that I know it is right." And he considered her words for a long moment, as if trying to measure their truth. And in that silence a new understanding passed between them, one that transcended fear and pride, and spoke of courage, of trust, and of hearts opening to each other despite the dangers that surrounded them. And when soldiers arrived at the ranch, asking questions and casting wary eyes across the property, Clara hid Dakota in the cellar beneath the bunkhouse, keeping her calm voice steady and her mind sharp, thinking of every story She had heard of Apache warriors, of the consequences of sheltering one, and yet she did not falter because she understood that some choices demanded bravery and love demanded even more. And when the soldiers left, she climbed down to check on him. And he looked up at her, eyes filled with gratitude and frustration, and whispered, "I should not have let you risk yourself." And she smiled faintly and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You risk nothing, you show what is right." And he studied her as if seeing her for the first time, fully as a woman, not a stranger, not a healer, not a helper, but as someone whose presence changed the landscape of his life entirely, and he felt the weight of his people, his duty, and his past, and yet for the first time he understood that love could be a choice that did not weaken but strengthened him. And Clara felt the same realization, a fire in her chest that matched the desert sun, a longing to protect and nurture, to be near, and to be recognized as more than the sum of her courage and her strength. And when Dakota told her he must leave to fulfill his duties, she nodded, understanding the call of responsibility that had shaped him since childhood, and she agreed to walk with him to the ridge, where the desert fell away into the valleys of his people, and they moved together. In silence, the only sounds the crunch of boots on dry soil, the distant cry of a hawk, and the wind rustling through sagebrush. And as they reached the edge, he turned to her, his eyes dark and intense. "You have shown me kindness I did not expect," he said, and she looked up at him, her gaze steady. "You have shown me trust and courage," she replied, and he felt it in every word and every syllable, a bridge forming between two hearts and two worlds that had long been separated by fear and history, and yet here they were crossing it willingly. And when Clara learned that Dakota had been injured again, she did not hesitate to ride with the Apache envoys into the mountains, her heart driven by loyalty and by a force she could not name. And when she found him, she saw not only a wounded warrior, but a man whose gaze softened at the sight of her, a man who had come to love in the quietest, deepest ways. And she stayed with him, tending his wounds, speaking softly, assuring him that she would not leave. And the Apache people began to accept her presence, recognizing the bond between their leader and this brave woman who had crossed into their world. And when Dakota recovered, he did something no king had done before. He asked her to join her life with his, to become his bride, to walk with him through the mountains, valleys, and deserts of their shared life. And Clara felt a joy she had never known, a fire that matched his own, and she said yes, embracing the path of love, honor, and connection that stretched before them into the unknown. And together they began to navigate a life where two cultures met, where duty and desire intertwined, where hearts had learned to trust. And in the quiet of the desert and the roar of the mountains, their love grew stronger with each day, each choice, each moment of courage and care. And neither could imagine life without the other, as they learned to speak the language of shared dreams, the language of loyalty and passion. And as the days passed, the desert seemed less harsh, the mountains less forbidding, and the story of Clara and Dakota became one of quiet legend, a tale of two hearts brave enough to face danger and daring enough to embrace love across worlds and boundaries that once seemed insurmountable. And through it all they discovered that love was not only the meeting of two people, but the blending of worlds, of histories, of challenges, of victories, small and great. And that in choosing each other they had chosen a path of courage, endurance, and the beginnings of a future that would echo across the desert long after their steps had faded into the sands. Dakota stood before Clara beneath the wide open sky of the Apache Valley, the mountains rising like silent sentinels around them, their shadows stretching long across the desert floor. And the wind carried the scent of sage and dust and pine, weaving through the canyons as if nature itself had paused to witness this moment, a moment neither time nor storm could erase. Clara adjusted the beaded shawl over her shoulders, the gift of the women of Dakota's people who had welcomed her with cautious eyes that slowly softened into respect, and her gaze met his as she felt the steady strength of the warrior she had come to know, the one who had fought for his people and survived storms both of the earth and of the heart. And he reached for her hand, his touch gentle yet firm, the kind that demanded trust and inspired courage. And she did not flinch, but instead held it, letting the warmth of his palm flow into hers, and in that instant they understood each other without words. The bond forged through trials and shared danger, and through the long nights, by the fire, through whispered conversations beneath the stars, through tending wounds and guiding horses and facing storms together. And Dakota looked into her eyes, dark and serious, and asked, "Have you done it before, standing beside a man like this, risking everything for love and life?" And Clara lifted her chin, meeting his gaze, and spoke softly, "Let me show you what I know." And the words carried with them the weight of promise and the fire of determination, and as she stepped closer, their foreheads touched, a gesture old as time among his people, a silent vow of connection, of trust, of hearts intertwined. And the desert seemed to hold its breath, the wind stilled, the birds circled lower as if to bear witness to the joining of two souls. And in that moment Dakota felt the warmth ripple through him, the kind he had only heard of in stories of ancient warriors who spoke of bonds that could outlast fire, flood, and war. And Clara felt it too, the strength of his presence, steady as a drumbeat in her chest, a rhythm that spoke of home and of belonging. And she knew she was ready to face whatever the future held with him beside her. And the ceremony began with hands bound by braided leather, a symbol of unity and trust, unbreakable in the eyes of their people. And Dakota spoke vows in the language of his ancestors, words that promised protection, loyalty, and eternal partnership. And though Clara did not fully understand each syllable, she felt their meaning deep in her soul, as if it had been written there before she was born. And when she spoke her own vows, she did so with a fierce heart and steady voice, promising to honor his people, to stand beside him, and to walk every sunrise together, facing dangers, joys, and the unknown side by side. And the valley seemed to echo with it approval, the chorus of drums rising, filling the air with a rhythm older than memory, stronger than doubt. And the mountains themselves seemed to bend closer, the wind carrying whispers of blessing, and every creature of the land standing witness to a love that had crossed boundaries and endured trials. And Dakota pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers, sealing their union in the oldest gesture of his people. And Clara whispered again softly, "Let me show you what I know." And with that she became not only his bride, but the bridge between two worlds, carrying the promise of peace, connection, and love that would endure beyond storms, beyond time, beyond the harshness of the desert. And in the quiet that followed the ceremony, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in colors of fire and gold. And Dakota held her hands, and they both felt the pulse of the land beneath their feet, and the rhythm of hearts joined as one. And as the night fell, they gazed at the stars, at the same constellations that had guided his ancestors and hers. And they understood that love like theirs was rare, fierce, and unyielding, and that the desert had tested them and the mountains had strengthened them, and that together they could face any storm, any threat, any future, because they had chosen each other fully, completely. And with the rising moon casting silver light on their faces, Dakota whispered words of gratitude and awe for the woman who had crossed into his world. And Clara felt the warmth of his love enveloping her, a shield, a home, a fire in the endless expanse of desert. And as the wind sang through the canyons, carrying their vows and their presence across the valley, they knew that nothing would ever be the same, that they had stepped into a story older than any book, yet entirely their own. And so beneath the open sky, the desert, and the mountains, as witnesses, Dakota and Clara began their life together, a life of love, of courage, of unity, a life that would forever echo and hawko in the winds and sands of the land that had brought them together. And they faced the dawn as one heart, as one soul, as one unbreakable bond, with the promise of "Let me show you what I know," guiding each step into a future shaped by choice, love, and the enduring power of two worlds joined. Life after their union was not easy or simple, because the world they lived in demanded courage and endurance every day, the desert and the mountains testing them, the people around them watching carefully for mistakes or signs of weakness. And yet Clara and Dakota faced each challenge together, side by side and hand in hand, learning to navigate two worlds that had long been separated by fear and history, and she learned the language of his people, their traditions, their ways of honoring the land, and he learned the rhythms of her life, the work on the ranch, the care for animals, the dreams. She held close, and slowly the boundaries between them blurred until they no longer mattered, because their hearts had found a home in each other. And the neighbors who had once feared the Apache began to see Clara riding beside Dakota, and the fear that had lingered like a shadow began to fade, replaced by respect, curiosity, and eventually understanding, and the mountains that had seemed foreboding became a place of refuge and connection, a place where the wind whispered promises of peace, and the desert that had seemed harsh and relentless became a landscape of memory and strength. And each night as firelight danced across their faces, Dakota would ask softly, teasingly, "Clara, do you regret choosing the life of an Apache king?" And she would smile and lean against him. "No," she would say, "I regret nothing." And he would look into her eyes, the deep dark pools reflecting the stars above, and he would murmur, "And loving me, have you done it before?" And she would always answer the same, "Let me show you what I know." And it became a rhythm, a language, a vow repeated in quiet moments and in the storms and dangers and joys of every day. And as years passed, their love grew stronger, rooted in trust and courage and understanding, and in the blending of two cultures that had once seemed impossible to unite. And Clara became a figure of respect and admiration among Dakota's people, a woman who faced every challenge with strength and heart, and Dakota became more than a warrior, more than a leader. He became a husband who cherished and honored the woman who had chosen him freely and completely. And together they faced drought and fire and raids from those who sought to stir conflict, and each trial made them stronger, more resilient, more united in purpose and in heart. And the children who would come to follow them would inherit not only courage and skill, but a legacy of love and unity. And the desert and the mountains seemed to recognize their bond, carrying whispers of their story across the valleys and ridges, across canyons and rivers to anyone who would listen, and the story became legend, a tale told around fires in Dulce Creek and among the Apache that spoke of a rancher woman and a warrior king who had chosen love above fear and trust above prejudice. And through it all, Clara and Dakota lived fully each day with gratitude and wonder, and the sun rising over the fully Ivindun desert was no longer just light and heat, but a symbol of the life they had built together, a life of choice and devotion, a life that bridged worlds and hearts. And in the quiet moments before sleep, when the wind stirred the leaves and the stars shimmered above, Dakota would hold her close, whispering soft words of awe and thanks, and Clara would rest her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart and the rhythm of their shared life. And together they would close their eyes, knowing that love had won over fear, that trust had conquered doubt, that courage had triumphed over danger, and that the story they had written together would endure longer than storms, longer than wars, longer than the desert and mountains that had first brought them together. And their love became a beacon, a legend, a guiding star for anyone who dared to cross boundaries, to face fears, and to choose love and connection over hatred and separation. And so their days passed full of labor, full of joy, full of tenderness, and full of a devotion that neither time nor circumstance could diminish. And every step they took was a step together, every challenge a test of their bond, every sunrise a new promise that they would face whatever came next, united in heart, in mind, and spirit. And in that union they found not only each other, but a reflection of what the world could be, when courage and love were allowed to lead, when fear was set aside, and when two hearts dared to say, "Let me show you what I know." And in that simple vow their legacy was sealed, a story of life, of love, of endurance, of two worlds joined. And the desert and the mountains would carry their story for generations, a tale of hope, of unity, of love stronger than blood, stronger than history, stronger than the endless horizon. And Clara and Dakota walked forward together into every sunrise, hand in hand, hearts entwined and souls forever joined.